NewsX World. Let's take a look at the top stories. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian has lashed out at American trade representatives' renewed aggression in dealing with China, stating that they are threatening to impose high tariffs and that is not the correct way to engage with Beijing. He's also stated that China will take resolute countermeasures to protect its interests if America insists on this course of action. Chinese President Xi Jinping has met with his counterparts from various countries at the Global Leaders Meeting on Women in Beijing. Leaders from Iceland, Ghana and Dominican Republic are amongst the nations and the leaders who've met him. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has stated that U.S. President Donald Trump remains on track to meet Chinese leader Xi Jinping in South Korea in late October as the two sides try to de-escalate tensions over tariff threats and export controls. Bessent has stated that there were substantial communications between both countries over the weekend and more meetings are expected to take place. US and China have rolled out special port fees on shipping firms registered in either countries as the trade war between the world's two largest economies expands. Now, the US first announced that this fee would be imposed earlier this year, and China, meanwhile, has levied reciprocal fees for US-linked ships in its ports, with now both set to activate today. China has now squarely blamed Philippine activities in the South China Sea as the root cause behind tensions in the region, stating that the video footage released by the Chinese Coast Guard speaks for itself and that facts once again prove that it is the Philippines' deliberate provocation which is behind the tensions in the South China Sea. US, Egypt, Qatar and Turkey have signed a joint Gaza declaration backing a ceasefire deal. Mediators have signed the document alongside US President Donald Trump. China previously reacted to the peace proposal but has made no further comments since then. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is all set to visit Washington this week as talks with US President Donald Trump are on the anvil. Zelensky will also meet US energy and defense firms and discuss the Tomahawk missile need. All right, viewers, those were the headlines and our top focus. Chinese ministry spokesperson Lin Jian has now slammed the United States' renewed aggression and threats of high tariffs, stating that this is not the correct way to engage with Beijing. Jian has also urged the United States to correct their wrongdoings and follow the mutual understandings reached between President Xi and Trump during their conversation on the phone line earlier this year. Listen in.
美方不仅没有反攻自省，反而以高关税相威胁，这不是同中方打交道的正确方式。中方敦促美方尽快纠正错误做法，以两国元首通话重要共识为引领，在平等、尊重和互惠基础上，通过对话解决各自关切，妥善管控分歧，维护中美关系稳定、健康、可持续发展。如果美方一意孤行，中方也必将坚决采取相应措施，维护自身正当权益。
Those comments of American Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who had made some remarks in a televised interview last night where he stated that China is fueling this trade war by purchasing Russian and Iranian oil, whereas the United States is fighting for peace in the world. Bessent has also called China's export controls and has announced on the day of the signing of the Gaza peace treaty as highly inappropriate and an attempt to get leverage before the meeting between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, which is scheduled for later this month. Take a look.
The Chinese economy is doing very poorly, and maybe they're trying to take focus off of that. Two, China, as opposed to the United States is pushing for peace in the world. China is financing war. China purchases of Russian oil is financing the Russian war machine. They purchase Iranian oil, and we have been calling them out on that. So maybe it was to distract from that. And three, maybe it was a mistaken attempt to try to gain leverage before the two leaders meet in Korea in October. And I can tell you, trying to get leverage in front of a meeting with Donald Trump is a bad idea.
Meanwhile, global oil prices have also responded to the latest back and forth between American and Chinese representatives. The Brent crude futures has risen 18 cents or 0.28% to $63.50 a barrel. Meanwhile, U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude was at $59.65 a barrel, up 16 cents or 0.27%. Now, in the previous session, Brent had settled 0.9% higher and US WTI closed up 1%. Now, the prospect of improved trade relations between the world's two largest economies has historically buoyed oil markets as investors anticipate stronger global growth and increased fuel demand. However, recent developments, including Beijing's expanded export controls on rare earths and Trump's threats of imposing a fresh 100% tariffs and software export restrictions starting November 1st, have now weighed on the sentiment. Last week itself, oil prices posted weekly losses and touched their lowest levels since May. With us on the broadcast is Mr. Andrew K.P. Leung. He is a strategist focusing on China's economy and its policy, joining us from Cairo. Thank you so much for taking out time and speaking to us on NewsX World. We've been tracking the global oil prices, but now with China's port fees and the restrictions on American ships that are going to be imposed, how will this hurt U.S. in particular and the global markets in the long term if both countries do not back down?
Well, of course, all the dynamics is not about oil. Oil is only one a particular aspect of the fraught relationship between the United States as the world's largest power and largest economy, and China is the second largest economy, but the world's largest trader and largest manufacturer by far. First of all, there are a number of strengths. First of all, the kind of negotiation, the kind of tactics applied by the United States, and in fact, most of the Western countries, is that you can just pick and choose as to what issue you want to talk about and forget about the others, as if you can just pick your winners and then force the rest on your counterparts. But that's not the way to negotiate with China. Coming from a different civilization, the mentality is holistic. In other words, you just can't put a knife in my back on the one side and talking nice to me on another. But the whole thing must be looked at holistically. Yes, if there are problems overall, let's talk about them in totality, so as to balance the relationships in its entirety, not just one by one. So that's, that translates into what's happening. The first statement by the Chinese Foreign Ministry saying that that's not the way to negotiate. Secondly, as far as the Iran is concerned, and for that matter, Russia over Ukraine, China's always the policy is for stability and for any conflict to be negotiated, to be discussed peacefully rather than through coercion. If you want to go to the coercion, countries are bound to defend their interests, and then especially with global powers and nuclear powers, they would lead to global Armageddon. So that's a second dimension of the broad relationship, in the sense that, of course, China has been buying oil from Iran, from Russia, but that's a long, long time ago, even before the conflicts happened, because China is an energy deficit country, and all these others are deficit surplus countries. and the economies are intertwined. It's not as if China is trying to have the war. China, of course, it's in China's huge interest to maintain a peaceful environment so as to grow its economy, so it expand its economic trajectory, bring better lives for its people. And by bringing better lives to its people, that translates into the legitimacy of China's governments. In fact, if you look at what happened in the latest research in the Harvard Kennedy School, in the endowment trust barometer based in New York, the Chinese government is the highest regarded by its people among many countries around the world, including many democracies. So again, that's the third trend of this thought, this understanding how to deal with China. And oil is only one side, not an overarching dimension of this relationship.
All right, so I request you to stay on with us. We're tracking some other crucial developments. Now, world leaders gathered in Beijing this week for the Global Leaders Meeting on Women, co-hosted by China and UN Women, aiming to advance gender equality and empower women worldwide. Chinese President Xi Jinping opened the summit with a strong call for broader female participation in politics and national governance. He has emphasized that true gender equality must be internalized in society and has linked women's development to national progress and social harmony. Meanwhile, leaders from Ghana, Iceland, Sri Lanka, Dominica and Mozambique are attending the two-day summit. President Xi has held bilateral talks with Ghanaian President John Dramani Mahama and Dominica's President Sylvanie Burton, highlighting China's commitment to international cooperation on women's issues. Now, the summit comes amid growing global calls for stronger female leadership, and it also comes as China is facing criticism over the lack of women in top government roles. Leaders have agreed that empowering women is essential for peace, stability and sustainable development. All right, viewers, more news coming in. The United States of America has condemned China over the ramming and water cannoning of a Philippine vessel that took place on the 12th of October. Now, this statement comes as both the Philippines and China have traded accusations over a maritime confrontation near a disputed island in the South China Sea. The dispute between the Philippines and China is regarding the islands of Zhongye-dao, Zhejiangjiao and Zhubixiao that Beijing that in fact are being claimed by both sides. Now, the United States has put out a fresh statement reiterating its support for the Philippines to maintain regional stability. However, the Chinese Foreign Ministry has in fact stated that the incident was a result of deliberate infringement and provocations from the Philippines. It was also stated that Philippine actions are the root cause of tensions in the South China Sea. Still with us on the broadcast is Mr. Andrew K.P. Leung. Interesting development coming in. Both Philippines and China are pinning the blame on each other for what transpired on the 12th of October. We've seen similar such scenes a couple of months back as well. What do you make of China's increasing militarization and its footprint in the South China Sea? It's obviously looking at expanding its presence over there, considering its strategic interests, but Philippines is in the meantime, with the backing of the United States, countering these moves.
Well, of course, the South China Sea is a very important conduit for China's sea lane of communication, through which passes through China's lifeblood, economic lifeblood, because China relies heavily on import of materials and goods to drive its economy. Apart from the territorial disputes with neighboring countries, the South China Sea has been increasingly, have long been weaponized by the United States in establishing the so-called first island chain centered in Okinawa, second China chain centered in Guam with a lot of American assets. It's as if your country is surrounded by hostile military forces. And China's, of course, response is how to militarize some of the islands, defend itself. And that, of course, translates into a lot of conflicts. Now, as far as the Philippines is concerned, again, it depends on who is in government. If you trace back the previous Philippine governments, like the third government, like the Royal government. They're all pro-China, and then there's much less conflict in the South China Sea. But then, of course, each pro-China Philippine government translate into an anti-China government, as in the current Marcos government. So apart from internal Philippine politics, the Trump administration is increasingly using the Philippines together with Japan, to a certain extent, of course, Australia, in the Quad, to contain China, and increasingly forming a military partnership between the Philippines and Japan, and to a certain extent South Korea, again in the South China Sea, to confront and contain China. And China is seeing this as a threat. So I think that China's always policy has always been through negotiations, and that translates into the conduct over the South China Sea with the ASEAN countries and its members. But that is not bought by the United States, because the United States sees the South China Sea as a very important tool to contain China's rise.
All right, so requesting you to stay on with us. We're tracking some other very crucial developments. The UK government is firmly denying any role in the collapse of a high-profile China spy case. This comes as charges against two men accused of passing sensitive information to Beijing were dropped last month. Reports claim that National Security Advisor Jonathan Powell has pushed for the case to be dropped in order to protect Chinese investment. In fact, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer's office has called the claims entirely false. Officials insist that the decision was made solely by the Independent Crown Prosecution Service. CPS Chief Stephen Parkinson has also stated that the case failed due to a lack of evidence showing China posed a threat during the alleged offences. Listen in to Britain's Security Minister.
We must tackle the threats China poses, from cybersecurity attacks, foreign interference and espionage targeting our democratic institutions, to the transnational repression of Hong Kongers in the UK. This government is unequivocal. The first duty of the government is to keep people safe, and we fully recognise that China poses a series of threats to UK national security. Yet we must also be alive to the fact that China does present us with opportunities.
Still with us on the broadcast is Mr. Andrew K.P. Leung. Interesting development coming in from the United Kingdom. There's been a lot of controversy surrounding this. A lot of criticism of the British government is coming out as well after this case has been dropped. Interestingly, in the meantime, we've also seen praise for Jonathan Powell by none other than Steve Witkoff. What are you making of all of these developments?
Well, of course, spying is the oldest profession in human history between countries, dating back thousands of years ago to even Egypt and Persia and Roman Empire and so on. It's nothing new. But of course, nowadays, it really translates into the proof of evidence, but also the diplomatic relationship or changing diplomatic relationship between various countries, and the severity, of course, these accusations. Well, the present case is dropped because of lack of evidence, obviously, but also it's a reflection of a recalibration of relationship, perhaps between the UK and China. And of course, this accusation about China weaponizing national security look no further than the weaponization of national security by the largest country, the most powerful country in the world, the United States. And of course, to a certain extent, various countries are weaponizing the national security issues as well. But as far as the China's national security is concerned, for example, the fugitives from Hong Kong, of course, they violated the national security law, and they have a history of activities which threaten the stability of Hong Kong, including condoning or plotting acts of violence and so on. So I think that leaving all these past history aside, what's happening now clearly is the collapse of the case due to lack of evidence, but also a reflection of a changing diplomatic relationship, a recalibration of relationship, perhaps between the United Kingdom and China.
All right, sir. With that, I would like to thank you for taking our time sharing your perspective on these very crucial stories. Meanwhile, we're tracking further updates. The United States, Egypt, Qatar and Turkey have signed the Gaza Declaration, ending the 2-year-long war in the Palestinian enclave. US President Donald Trump has hailed this as a tremendous day for the Middle East, as he, along with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan have signed a declaration meant to cement a ceasefire in Gaza hours after Israel and Hamas exchanged hostages and prisoners. Meanwhile, China has welcomed the release of the hostages as part of the ceasefire deal. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian has stated that China supports all efforts to restore peace and alleviate the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Lin Jian has in fact added that the post-war governance of Gaza should uphold the principle that Palestine is governed by Palestinians itself and that future arrangements should align with the two-state solution. This is the latest that we're tracking. We've seen a landmark development in the Middle East take place yesterday itself with the exchange of the hostages and the prisoners taking place. There are over 2,000 Palestinian prisoners who were languishing in Israeli jails who have now been released. They've got to go home, meet their families, and the hostages who were held captive for more than 700 days have now also reunited with their families in Israel. This is, of course, the first phase of Donald Trump's 20-point peace plan that is being implemented. Negotiations have been taking place in Egypt's Sharm el-Sheikh, and we've seen more than 20 world leaders gather in Egypt as this declaration was signed. The deal was signed hours after the hostage release had taken place. But that is not all. Of course, there were some elements of the deal that were contentious, that do require a lot more deliberation, for which there will be further rounds of negotiation. There are some sticking points that have emerged, whether it is the disarmament of Hamas, its role in the governance of post-war Gaza. It is stated that it will not be involved, but what actually transpires on the ground remains to be seen. It has accepted the formation of a technocratic Palestinian leadership body that will take forward the governance of post-war Gaza. In the meantime, there has been no word about the formation of an international body of peace. This is something that Trump has mooted in his lengthy plan. That's not all. We are in fact seeing, as you can see on those visuals on your screens, you can see the Palestinian prisoners reuniting with their families. We're also seeing some very heartwarming visuals of the hostages also meeting their loved ones. It's quite a landmark moment, a historic moment that will hopefully bring an end to the war and ensure enduring peace in the Middle East. There's, of course, cautious optimism on the ground, both sides. People are elated, but they're of course concerned whether the war would resume or not, whether the ceasefire will hold for good or not. With us on the broadcast is Dr. Wael Awad, Middle East Affairs expert, joining us from New Delhi. Thank you so much for taking our time and speaking to us on NewsX World. Of course, I've taken our viewers and given them an overview of what's happened yesterday. Interesting reaction coming in from China. China earlier, when the war was going on, did try to bring all parties together before Trump was elected, but somehow things could not materialize, and it's the United States that has now emerged as the broker. So what does this really say about the role of China, China's ambitions of becoming a major global player, especially in the Middle East?
Well, thank you for having me. I think what the Chinese have been doing, just like the rest of the nations, especially the UN security members and the regional powers, which wanted to find a solution to this crisis and put an end to the onslaught on the Palestinians. So they have been trying to push hard the deal, but I think the credit goes to President Trump, where he could put his pressure on and he could make Prime Minister Netanyahu come to the table and sign this agreement. And that's a very good indication that it's only the United States who have the influence on Israel to come to the term with the American and the Israelis. But however, I think the Chinese have been always staying away from the political intervention in any countries over the years. But having said that, I would say that over the decades, we have noticed that the Chinese also wanted to have footprints in many of the countries where the road, BRI, the initiatives taken by Xi Jinping in 2013, have wanted to see that the interests of China has been protected. So I think they wanted to see more stability in the region, because that's also part of their objective of completing the road belt, one road, one belt, BRI.
Mm-hmm. All right, so with that, I'd like to thank you for taking out time sharing your perspective with us on NewsX World. With that, viewers, we're shifting focus away from the Middle East towards the war in Europe. Now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is to travel to the United States to meet US President Donald Trump this week. President Zelensky has stated that he would also hold talks with defense and energy companies as well as members of the Congress. He has further said that the main topic of discussion will be air defense and long-range capabilities. President Zelensky has stated that he shared with President Trump his vision over a phone call regarding the need for Tomahawk missiles. Trump has meanwhile stated that he could transfer Tomahawks if Russia does not stop the war. Ukraine is seeking further US assistance to protect its electricity and gas networks, which have faced attacks from the Russian side. The recent strikes on Ukrainian energy grids are attributed to the drone attacks by Russia. There are in fact reports that China has helped Russia in gaining an advantage in the battlefield as well. All right, viewers, speaking of China helping Russia gaining an advantage on the front line, there's a fresh report that has now emerged that China has materially helped Russia gain an advantage in its grinding war against Ukraine. Beijing has dramatically increased its exports over the summer of key components needed to make fiber optic drones. That is not all. Chinese sales of lithium-ion batteries to Russian drone makers has also surged over the summer. Now, Beijing claims that it is neutral in the conflict, and despite the no-limits friendship between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping, Beijing has not sent any military hardware to help Moscow's fight. In fact, last year itself, China stated that it would restrict exports of drones and drone parts with military applications. Additionally, Chinese manufacturers, which account for about 80% of the global commercial drone market, have reduced their direct exports of ready-made drones to Russia. However, official Chinese trade data now shows that it has allowed a sharp increase in the components that are enabling Russian manufacturers to build fiber optic drones. Now, these drones are being increasingly used by Moscow because they are less susceptible to interception. Now, according to data from China's Customs Office, Chinese shipments of fiber optic cables to Russia have grown almost tenfold between July and August. This is after hitting record highs in May and then again in June. In August itself, China exported record lengths of fiber optic cables to Russia amounting to 328,000 miles. Now, in contrast, its supply to Ukraine is a mere fraction. China sold only 72 miles of cables to Ukraine in August. This, of course, is having significant implications on the battlefield, as lighter and longer cables have allowed Russia to expand its range of attacks further into Ukrainian territory. Meanwhile, exports of lithium-ion batteries used to power the drones also shot up over the summer. Now, to put this into perspective, lithium-ion batteries and their exports to Russia stood at a record $54 million in June before dipping slightly to $47 million in August. This has coincided with Russia stepping up its aerial assault in Ukraine. Exports of lithium-ion batteries to Ukraine, meanwhile, tracked only $11 million to $12 million a month over the same period. Now, the United States and EU have imposed multiple rounds of sanctions on Russian and Chinese companies, but this has done little to slow the flow of items that can be used for both civilian and military purposes. such as these cables and batteries. All right, viewers, it's a wrap on the China Report on NewsX World. Continue staying put for more news and updates.